In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the architect's role on a project. And this lecture could also be titled, What Does an Architect Really Do? Because we've talked about the media depictions of architects and the realization, perhaps, that not a whole lot of the general public really understands what it is that an architect does. We have these images of someone sitting at a drafting table and maybe sketching some things out. But the idea that drawing or maybe some sketching is all that an architect does is just a very small picture of what actually goes on. Now, when we talk about what the architect does or the architect's role, we have to talk about it in terms of a project, kind of in the context of a building project. Because if we look at a completed building, it took many steps to get to that point. And so it's a process. And the creation of a building from the inception of the idea all the way to it being completed and constructed can be a lengthy process, but it's certainly a process. And it typically follows a fairly prescribed set of steps. And along the way, the architect has various tasks and roles that he or she needs to fulfill. So that's kind of what we want to talk about, is what is involved. Sometimes we'd refer to this as the stakeholders on the project. Who are the stakeholders in the project? And the architect is one of the stakeholders because they have duties to fulfill on the project. Certainly the owner is a stakeholder because they have a vested interest in getting this project completed and they're paying for it. The contractor is a stakeholder, and there are all kinds of parties and people that are affected along the way in this project. So let's take a look at the process. When we discuss the role of the architect and the role of other people within the process, we look at the very beginning. So the very beginning is when the architect becomes involved. Now, there's probably several steps before this that are on the owner side. So perhaps the owner sees a need for a building project, perhaps they raise funds, but we're going to look at the role of the architect. So we kind of pick it up where the architect becomes involved. So on the we look at the very beginning of the process, and we're going to pick up this process when the architect becomes selected. Now, there are probably other steps that occurred before architect selection, but because we're looking at the role of the architect and the role that they play in the project, we're going to kind of pick it up here. But what probably happened before this point, or prior to the architect being selected, is the client or owner acknowledged some need for a building project, whether it's new construction or renovation or addition. They might have even had some phase of fundraising or generating funds. Especially on a public project, maybe they had to have bonds approved by the public. But when we look at architect selection, we're assuming that the funds have been raised and the owner is ready to proceed with the project. Now, there are several ways that the architect can be selected, and from the architect's point of view, you need to continually get projects in order to stay in business. So this process of getting work, completing work, and then getting new work is constant. Now, some ways that you can get jobs or become selected by an owner are simply coming in contact with them. Perhaps you've worked with them before, they liked your work, or they know of your work and they contact you. Perhaps the client is either a corporate entity, or maybe they have some group where they've put together kind of a short list of architects that they might contact and look at several people on a list that they've compiled. But there are a few different ways that this might proceed. So one would be just simply being interviewed by the client. So either the architect is familiar to the client, or the client has contacted a list of people, and they will come and just physically look at your work. And they might look at similar projects that you've done. They might look at the breadth of your work. Oftentimes, when we talk about portfolios, a lot of times students think it's a student portfolio, that students have to put together a portfolio in order to proceed through school or to eventually get a job. But firms and architects keep portfolios of their work so that they can show potential clients and future clients all of the things that they've done, show completed work, and it helps if there are similar building types that the client is interested in, or even if it's not a similar building type, that they share a design aesthetic or similar, mentality in terms of what's desired. So a lot of times clients will pursue architects whose work they might be familiar with, but it's always helpful to show the client the portfolio and range of work. And then after the architects are interviewed, the owner goes back and decides. If it's a group of people on the owner side, they might have some meetings about who should be selected. They might have a committee for architect selection. If it's a small project, maybe it's just one or two people. On a residential project, you'd probably have just a few interviews with a few architects, and then the client would decide who they would like to select. Another way that architects can be selected is by request for qualifications, or an RFQ. Oftentimes an RFQ is used on a project where public funds are being used, or there's a large issue of public concern. That's not always the case, but sometimes a public project might have a requirement that a request for qualifications go out. And what that means is a proposal will be put together by the owner that they would like architects to prepare different schemes for consideration in order to be selected for a particular project. Now, an RFQ is how it's normally referred to. An RFQ can actually be quite expensive for the architect, because what will happen, and you see in this photo, that a design team will put together several schemes, and they have kind of these internal working sessions about what their proposal should look like. And when I say proposal, it means they're proposing a certain design for this project. And it's usually a schematic type of design, meaning it's preliminary, but it gives the client some idea of what potentially they might do on the project, and so that they can pick from several schemes. But usually it has to be a fairly significant enough project where the architect is willing to put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and essentially a lot of money, because that's employee hours and their own time and resources, and they may not get that project. So if several firms are putting together proposals, then they may not look at that. So sometimes you see request for proposals, or RFP, RFQ, typically we're talking about where a short list of architects have been selected, and they're asked to put together proposals, and then they're considered by the owner. A recent example of this is the Obama Presidential Library, which has not yet been constructed or designed even, but they have asked several architects to put together proposals through this RFQ, and it has certain requirements. So everybody gets the same list of requirements, and then they're given a kind of tight timeline in which to put together a proposal. But because that's a significant project of high public interest and a high profile project, then those architects are typically motivated to put together a proposal. Another way that an architect can be selected is through a design competition. Now, typically a design competition is a little bit more formal than the RFQ process. Even though the RFQ process is quite formal, the design competition is usually open to all architects who would like to participate in that building competition or that building design competition. So RFQ usually is an invited list, usually a fairly short list of firms, and typically fairly prominent or selected for their significance by the client or the owner. And the design competition is managed by someone who is selected by the owner. So it's typically not run by the owner. The owner will empower someone to run the design competition. It's open to all architects, and then what will happen is everyone has the same set of parameters, the same set of rules. There's a date by which all submissions are due, and typically the submissions will be listed like, you need to provide 3D renderings and plans and models or whatever they decide as part of the competition. And then usually the competition is juried, meaning they put together a panel of people known as a jury, and instead of the client or the owner deciding who is the winner of the competition, it's the jury who decides who the competition winner is. And in some ways, there's a bit more fairness in the sense that it's open to anyone who wants to provide a submission. If there are questions from people who put in an entry for the design competition, that same person will answer all questions in the same way, and so everyone has access to the same information. And oftentimes they're blind juries, meaning they'll ask that you don't put your firm name or your name on any of the materials so that they can look at just the proposals themselves. In a way, it's really beneficial to firms that are smaller or starting out who want to get maybe a larger project or a more significant project where they may not have been included as part of an RFQ because they don't have as much significance or notoriety perhaps, but there are a lot of talented firms that are either smaller or younger, starting out, who are able to access projects through design competitions. And even if you don't win the competition, a lot of times you can include that design entry as part of your firm's portfolio. And that helps to kind of build work and build a portfolio of work so that you can potentially get more projects. A lot of times, we talk about getting jobs. And if you were to go pursue a job, any kind of job, the old adage is you can't get the job without experience, and you can't get experience without the job. That's sometimes the case for architecture firms that are trying to start out. It's hard for them to get new work because they don't have work to show, and so the design competition provides a realm for them to be able to kind of generate some work, even if it's not built work, that they can compile in their portfolio. When the architect is selected, we talk about something called the scope of work. And we look at this timeline, and we'll keep referring back to this timeline or these phases of a building project. And the scope of work just means, what do the client and architect agree is the accepted general parameters of what the architect is supposed to be doing on this project. Sometimes the scope of work is small, and maybe the owner, says, I know exactly what I want. I want you to just produce some drawings for me, or maybe there's just a small design scope, and then I want this certain amount of construction documents, or perhaps the scope of work is really wide and they want the architect to put together early budget analysis and research and all kinds of other things. And so the scope of work needs to be determined at the beginning of the project, because everybody, both client and architect, needs to know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And when we look at this timeline, there's the architect's duties and the client's duties at the bottom. And sometimes, we don't really think about what the client's duties are. And we think, well, they're hiring the architect, so they must just pay them and kind of sit back and not really do anything. But the client obviously needs to make decisions along the way. And anyone who's ever been a client on a building project can tell you that those decisions are sort of never ending. There are constant series of decisions that need to be made on the owner side. And so this kind of lays out when and where those approvals and those decisions need to be made, because the entire timeline of the project is really a back and forth between the client and the architect. The architect producing work, the client approving it or not approving it, the architect continuing to, work within those phases, and then the cycle continues. So the scope of work needs to be determined so that everyone knows what it is that they're supposed to be working on. The other thing that we'll talk about, and we'll see a bit later, is the idea of deliverables. And deliverables are something that are essentially tangible items that are going to be produced throughout each phase of the project that the architect can turn over to the client either for approval or basically to fulfill their responsibilities contractually and throughout the project. And once the scope of work has been determined, the architect and the owner will sign an agreement. Now, there are all kinds of agreements that get signed on a building project, but the one that we typically focus on early on is the agreement between the owner and the architect. Now, this is an agreement between owner and design builder, so perhaps if the architect and builder are in combination, you might have something like this. But if it's just the architect and the owner, you would sign a specific document that addresses that. Much of the time, architects are going to use these AIA documents. And remember, the AIA stands for American Institute of Architects, but that's the professional organization that represents architects. And there are these series of standard agreements and legal documents. They're called AIA contract documents that really start to lay out all of the things that are pretty standard on building projects. And you can customize them as you need to, but using the AIA contract documents really helps a lot of architects kind of manage what it is that they're going to be responsible for. It addresses many of the concerns that architects might have about liability and deliverables, meaning if you are going to create 3D models or even digital models, who is going to own those? Do you hand those over to the client at the end of the project? Does the author or the architect keep those? Do they retain ownership rights? All of these things can be addressed and sorted out in the contract document or the agreement process. Now, you could sign another contract. You could have an attorney, write up or, create a specific document that addresses your concerns, but you can also alter some options in the contract document, the AIA contract documents. And I'd say the majority of architects typically refer to those AIA contract documents because it talks about things that are specific to architectural projects, and it helps things for the architect and for the owner. It's not like it just protects the architect. It protects the owner from, not being sure what the deliverables are or what the time frame is or fees or anything like that. So it addresses the idea of what the scope of work is, what both parties are agreeing to, what the deliverables are going to be, what the architect is going to produce for the client, what the fee structure is going to be, and usually the time frame in which the architect is going to deliver their materials. Now, when we talk about basic services on the architectural side means you're going to go through these general phases of a project and have kind of a baseline level of deliverable items. So typically you'd go through what we refer to as PreDesign, and we'll talk about that in a minute. PreDesign, schematic design, design development, construction documents, and construction administration. So those are kind of basic services, like taking you through the full range of a building project. Now, anything that is not included in basic services, we just refer to that as additional services. So there are contract documents that outline additional services. Examples of additional services might be things like you had contracted with the client to produce, a certain amount of documents and drawings and models throughout the project, but maybe they need some materials for fundraising early on, and they'll say something like, well, this was not part of our original agreement, but we'd really like you to do like an animation and fly through of your 3D model and a bunch of renderings that are really photorealistic so that we can show potential donors for additional fundraising. Because usually if that's not included in basic services, that takes a lot of time on the architect's part, and that's money that they're spending to produce these items. So perhaps that's something that they agree to as part of additional services beyond the basic services, and then you might sign a short agreement for additional services, agree on a price, agree on a timeline, and then that document is in place in addition to the basic services that you agreed on earlier. Negotiating fees is a critical part of not only forming the agreement, but following procedures throughout the project. So for example, if you're negotiating your fees between the architect and the owner, from the owner's point of view, they may have some idea about what they're willing to spend or how they want their fees to be structured. And sometimes a client prefers one method or another. Sometimes the architect prefers one method or another. The main thing is that it is a negotiation in the beginning when you're going to sign your agreement, so that everybody's happy with the way the fees are structured. You can address when payment will occur, when the owner will pay the architect. Sometimes it's linked to deliverables, meaning at each phase of the project, if the architect produces a certain amount of documents and hands them over, potentially they will get paid for that phase. The two main types of fee negotiation or fee structure that we look at, one we refer to as cost plus, and it's really a little bit more lengthy phrase. It's cost plus a multiple of direct expense, and that just means the principals of the firm and their employees are billed to the client at cost, like at their cost, which includes their overhead and all of that, plus a certain multiplier so that they can build in profit to their fees. So maybe the multiplier is 2 to 3 times what their actual costs are, because if the architect has overhead such as paying their employees and insurance and professional liability insurance and, office space and all of those things that are required by them to run the business, maybe they'll charge the client an hourly rate of 2 to 3 times what their actual cost would be. Because if they just charged their actual cost, they would make $0. They would be basically, working this project just for the sake of working it, and they wouldn't get paid any money. Now, sometimes the owner might not want to do cost plus just for whatever reason. Maybe it's a more lengthy project, and instead of doing kind of an hourly fee, they might do a percentage of construction, because maybe it's going to be like a several year project, or it's a much larger scope of a project. So it might be like, a few percentage points of the total total construction cost. So it can vary anywhere between, maybe about 6% of the total construction cost up to around 10% of the construction cost. So it just kind of depends on what the project is. Sometimes residential is even a bit more because it's fairly design intensive, but with a lower budget. But if you had something like, a hospital that costs like $200 million, maybe it would be like around, 8 to 10%, or maybe a school or something would be less because public work, maybe it's around 6%. Some architects, because they're able to, can charge much more. Maybe it's like 15%. But it's all a negotiation. So the percentage of construction as a cost is definitely used, and so is cost plus, the cost plus a multiplier. The first phase that we look at, once you have negotiated your fees, you've signed an agreement with the owner, you then embark on the first main phase of the project. And we refer to that as pre-design. Now, if you noticed before, pre-design might not necessarily be included in basic services. Usually there is pre-design included in basic services. It just kind of depends on what exactly the client wants as pre-design. So it's kind of a catch-all category where it's anything before design starts. Sometimes the owner might not have a need for a lot of pre-design services. Sometimes they might have lots of pre-design services that they require, but we'll take a look at a few of those. The main feature of pre-design, or the most common component of pre-design, is programming. And really, every project needs programming, or every project requires programming. It just kind of varies project to project depending on how involved programming might be. This is an institutional project, and you see these kind of graphs or this matrix that's involved where it talks about relationships between rooms. And this is part of the programming phase where you're going in and addressing and determining client needs, and then you start to say, well, okay, they've told us they need all of these rooms and spaces. They need a lobby and reception area, an employee lounge, and classrooms. And then you start to look at, well, which one of these spaces need to relate to the other ones, or which ones do you not want to be next to the other ones. Sometimes you might not want, if you're doing a library, you wouldn't want the mechanical room that's making a lot of equipment noise or generating a lot of equipment noise right next to the reading room of the library. So in programming, you would say, okay, we need a big space for reading and we need a big space for mechanical equipment, but we don't want those next to each other. Now, sometimes this is done by the architect. Sometimes programming is done by the architect. But often on larger projects, like larger corporate and institutional projects, a programming consultant is brought in, and they may be specialized in creating architectural programs. And basically what they do is they interview everyone who's going to be a user of the project. Like if you're doing a corporate campus, for example, then the programmer would go in and they would interview people in all the different departments of that company, and they would say, okay, what is it that you are seeking in a new space? What is it that works or does not work in your current space? As far as these spaces relate to one another, how could we go in and improve this? What is the purpose for you making this building project anyway? And programming is really getting down to the core of what the client needs are. Now, on a residential project, it might be that the architect does this. The architect just interviews the client in a series of meetings to determine what their needs are, and then, makes some like notes and some lists and other things, and then that may be it. But on a larger project, programming requires a lot of kind of charting and graphing of information, data collection. It's almost like doing a ton of research on how that particular organization operates, almost like a sociological study, and then translating that into what the building will need. Now, programming, though, does not dictate the design of the project. So there's no designing that goes on. We're just assessing client needs, and they're just saying, okay, here are some what we'd call adjacencies, meaning what needs to be what next to what, and it's up to the architect to kind of interpret that in the way that they see fit. Another thing that could potentially be involved in pre-design is budget analysis. Now, the client probably has some idea of the budget in their mind, and they might have a number that they cannot go over, or maybe that they would like to hit, but they could go a little bit beyond that. And so sometimes we'll look at budgeted costs versus actual costs as we're projecting them out, or when we talk about invoice costs on this image, that's actual costs that have been paid out. And so, there's kind of this running budget analysis that often takes place. But certainly at the beginning of the project, we need to look at budget as far as, where the architect needs to be for the client. Meaning, when they're selecting materials, when they're selecting building systems, they need to have the budget clear in their minds so that they're not selecting things that are going to be way over budget. And typically, honestly, we're talking about things that are over budget. I don't know that clients have problems all the time with architects coming in way under budget on what they've selected. Now, that would be great, but we're always trying to keep to a particular budget, and having knowledge of that in the beginning is really critical. Schedule development is also very important at the beginning of the project. Typically, we're doing that all in pre-design. So, when we're talking about pre-design, it's anything that's taking place before design starts. And usually, you need to get the budget hashed out. If you've got any issues about fundraising or where to get the money, that's got to happen in pre-design usually. And also schedule development. So there are lots of things that are contributing to the development of the schedule. It could be the client needs. It could be the architect's availability, if they've got other projects going on. It could be if they have a contractor potentially in mind. What is the contractor's availability? Here in Austin, that's becoming more of an issue about with as much building as there is going on. when are people available to work on this, and how long is this going to take? If the contractor is busy with other projects, can they focus on this and get it done in a certain amount of time? Can the architect get this done in a certain amount of time? And different clients have different scheduling needs. Some projects have really definitive, solid goals or targets that they need to hit. I worked on a college campus building once where, their absolute drop dead deadline was in August of a certain year. And it was a few years away, but they had to hit that deadline because they were scheduling classes in that building. Departments were moving into that building, and, the start of the fall semester was their absolute deadline. And so, the schedule basically got backed up from that point. It's instead of starting, on the day that you make the schedule, oftentimes you determine when the client absolutely needs that building, and you'll start to backtrack and determine, what the schedule looks like from there. And that really leads us to project delivery. And this is just a fancy way of saying, how are you going to get this project done? So it takes into account the schedule, it takes into account the budget, and it takes into account the type of project that it is, and the owner's desire for, typical types of construction methods or whatever it happens to be. When we talk about project delivery methods, the most traditional project delivery method would be the owner, this one on the left, we refer to that as design, bid, build, where the owner hires a designer or the architect, they design everything, and then they would send everything out. Once all the documents and models were done, they would send that out for bidding, which means they would invite multiple contractors to make proposals on the construction documents that the architect has done, and then they would say, okay, well, I can build this building in this amount of time with this amount of money, and then the owner would select from those bids. This is a really lengthy process, but typically might be required on a public project where you're required to take the lowest bid for the project. Design build is a lot shorter, and it has, some pros and cons, just like design bid build has some pros and cons. Some owners love design build because they have a single point of contact, and design build just means they're architects and contractors in one single entity or one single company. Typically the timeline is a lot shorter, communication is quicker for the owner. Usually there's not as much documentation because there's kind of a shorthand between the architects and contractors of the same company. So if the owner has a desire for a lot of, drawings or documentation, that may not be the best delivery method for them. But then there are things like alternative delivery methods where we talk about the designer as the construction manager, and it's like a little bit more free form. There are other types of project delivery methods. One is we refer to as integrated project delivery, where it's not design build, but the contractor is brought on pretty early in the process so that they can give a lot of feedback to the architect as they're designing, and they can give a lot more cost estimation earlier on, or they could say, okay, well, if you detailed it or designed it this way, we could do this. And so there's a lot more collaboration early on in the process. That's becoming a lot more popular, especially with the rise of building information modeling or 3D modeling technology, where a lot of contractors are modeling things early on, perhaps even in pre-design. And so they might collaborate with the architect in an integrated form of project delivery or integrated project delivery. So the first phase is pre-design, and the next main phase is schematic design. Now, schematic design is the first phase in which designing actually takes place. Pre-design is all of those things that are necessary or required by the owner on that project and have been agreed upon with the architect, but don't include design. They don't include any consideration of, designing the project. Now, they may have the architect do some initial research in pre-design, and maybe there's some analysis or research that takes place, and there's potentially, information gathering and fact finding, but usually designing is not taking place. So that's why programming is in pre-design, because it's researching and gathering information but not designing the building. So in schematic design, there are a lot of initial things that we need to look at for the best possible result in terms of creating a building scheme that's going to work. So there's lots of analysis that you'll see in schematic design. Some of this, if it's a lengthy project, might be included contractually in pre-design, but as part of basic services, oftentimes it's in schematic design. But we look at the site, definitely. What are the prevailing climatic considerations of the site? Where is the sun shining on the site? Are there shadows on the site from adjacent buildings? Where are the prevailing winds? Or are they coming from a certain direction? Are there trees on the site? Are there, what kind of soil is on the site? This is where you would start to get engineering analysis of the soil. You would test the soil with what we call a geotechnical engineer. You'd have them go out and drill the site and give you some analysis. That may even happen in pre-design as part of your research, but certainly needs to happen prior to designing the building, because you need to know what is happening literally on the ground of the site. You need to complete a really solid code and zoning analysis, meaning you need to determine all of the regulations that are going to be prevailing upon the site that you're working with. And when we talk about code and zoning, if I'm in Austin and I'm an architect, but I'm going to do a project in Los Angeles, then I need to determine all of the codes and zones that are applicable in Los Angeles, because I may be familiar with codes here, but all of the code and zoning requirements have to do with where the project is located. So sometimes it might be a learning process for the architect if you're not familiar with the way things are done in that area or whatever codes they happen to be using. We're talking about codes, we're talking about building codes, and also zoning, what type of project can be built with what type of use in that area. If you have a client who wants to build a project of a certain use, but that use is not allowed for that area, then you either need to apply to the city council or whoever is in charge in that jurisdiction for some kind of variance application, or you got to figure something else out pretty quickly, because that's going to be a huge factor in the design of the building. Transit and circulation analysis. How do you get to the site? How do you get people in and around the site? Is it accessible by car? Is it accessible by bus? Is it accessible by subway or bike or car or pedestrians? All these kinds of things. You need to do some analysis and research into that so that it will help influence your design, because you don't want to look at the design of the project just as kind of an abstract thing, because you could be designing something that is not useful to anyone if it can't be accessed. If people can't access it, then it's not going to be effective. So you want to do this analysis, and oftentimes the analysis starts to shape the design of the project.
And, if people are able to come from one direction of the site, maybe that's where the entrance is to the building. Maybe that's where the public spaces need to be. And, one thing that we're constantly looking at as architects is, not just the visitors to the building, but, how many types of users are going to be using that building. If you have a grocery store that you're going to be building, yes, people are going to shop in that grocery store, but you're going to have large trucks that are making deliveries every day. And if there are no large trucks that are able to get to that particular site, then you either need to create a way for them to get there so that they can deliver food and grocery items every day, or there needs to be like enough turnaround space for a truck to be able to get in and out, to be able to park, all these kinds of things. So it's like a logistical set of guidelines, and you're trying to analyze those existing circumstances so that you can make the best design going forward. Another thing that you need to look at, or the architect needs to look at in schematic design, is the context and the scale of the surrounding buildings. So when we talk about context, it's really anything that is in and around the site where this project is going to be built. So it could be, the scale of the buildings are kind of these residential type, small structures like we see here. It's kind of like a residential neighborhood plan with a park that's proposed. Or it could be, in a central business district corridor downtown in a city with tall buildings. The context doesn't even have to be buildings. It could be, is the context like trees and hills and, a rural area. But every site is going to have some kind of context. And, the scale of what's around it is potentially going to inform what you're able to build and also what might be appropriate for being built there. And then when we look at the actual design of the building, you're going to go through, as the architect, several massing and design schemes. And when we talk about massing, it's creating studies of the volume of the building that you're thinking of proposing. And so this is a good kind of exercise in several massing and design schemes. And, schematic design doesn't mean you just make one idea or create a model and drawings of one idea. You're going to have several ideas that you're probably going to propose to the client. And the whole idea with schematic design is you're going to keep proposing and keep working through different design schemes until you hit on one that the owner approves. You're not going to move on to the next phase until the owner says, yes, this is what I want it to look like. Let's move on to the next phase. They might, the architect might propose several schemes. And in the book, the author Hal Box talks about how he went into a client meeting in schematic design and he had 7 schemes and he was really proud of all of them. And the owner was like, I like 0 of these. And that happens, right? They might say, I don't like any of these, or this doesn't work for what we have in mind, or we just need to keep working through it. And sometimes, like in the case of the author of the book, he said it made for a lot better building because what I assumed were priorities, the client had a more detailed and nuanced view of what the users actually needed. And, a lot of times that rejection makes for a much better building because you're refining the process. And it helps to go through this exercise of creating different schemes and going back and forth. And also having multiple schemes allows the owner to say, okay, I like what you're doing here. I like this part of this one and I like this part of this other one. Is it possible to kind of combine those ideas or mash those ideas up in a way that will result in something else. And so then you kind of literally and figuratively as the architect go back to the drawing board and you kind of keep working through that. So schematic design is always kind of a fluid process. Most people I don't think make a super strict timeline. I mean, you want to hit your project deadlines, but often that's up to the owner, right? If they say, okay, it's not quite there yet, we need to keep going in schematic design, then you keep going in schematic design. And no one proceeds until that scheme is solidified and agreed to by the owner, and then the architect continues on. So when we talk about deliverables, the idea of schematic design deliverables generally follows a list similar to this. And I say generally because depending on the project, it can be all kinds of things, right? It could be, that the client wants a certain type of renderings or whatever it is. But usually you're going to have some massing studies like we looked at in the previous slide. But you'll also have site plan, floor plans that show all of the areas that the owner needs, elevations, sections, and by elevations I just mean the side views of the building, what the different sides of the building are going to look like. Sections, it's a cut through the building, what it looks like if you slice through the building, kind of like a dollhouse and broke it apart and looked inside. What does that look like? The area analysis, meaning, have you looked at the context? What did that bring up in terms of schematic design research? And then renderings and probably also 3D models. So potentially physical 3D models, digital 3D models, and probably both or either hand or digital 3D renderings. And a lot of times in schematic design, they'll use these to, show people in the public, show fundraisers, show, their, the rest of their organization, so that people can stay apprised of what schematic design looks like. And then a lot of times there will be included a preliminary cost estimate. Now, if the client has not yet selected the contractor, then the contractor is not going to be doing that preliminary cost estimate. So at this point, you might hire a third-party consultant just to evaluate the drawings that you have so far and just do a rough cost estimate just to see if you're sort of, within budget. If you're way off, this will be able to inform you of that. And, if you're like looking to maybe cut something out, this is a good point to do it because you haven't gone so far in the design process that it's, much more painful to revise things. You could maybe say, okay, well, we're so far over budget that maybe we're going to phase this project. Like we'll do one part now and we'll do another part later on.